that as revolutionaries and as freedom fighters and people that are involved in wanting to and needing to have our people to come to a higher level, is that the first impulse oftentimes that happens is when if a person is not in a right in what's referred to as a righteous state of mind, meaning they have knowledge of self to the point to where they don't see themselves as being inferior, or they have an inferiority complex. When I engage in a conversation and I sound like I'm more intelligent than you, I may be intimidated, or I may find that to be a problem. So right then and there, I'm going to put my guard up as we have a discussion, because of me not being at a right place within myself. I'm going to come off and say, oh, you think you better than me. So now all of a sudden we can't even have a good dialogue, because it done turned into some what I call nigga shit now.
Evolving barbaric hieroglyphs, I spit my gifts, shift your surface with vernacular skill. The rawest live, touching down like meteors, none other than black gods. Stones in my timepiece coming from black stars. Negativity for keep far away from doors. Single-mindedly destroying the ops and the odds. Just another warrior's quest. The past may get rest. Demons coming for my crown, get beheaded like the next. These blessings never threats, just to verbalize a message, catching energies of critics, all the Atari get deaded. Pray I stay alert on the field, be skillmatic in anything my enemies deal. Be dead actions, I proceed just life I lead beneath it. So many seas to win, it's our time to align stars. So spirits lead, who could war with me? Catastrophically or audibly, given no choice by God's law. I'm Lucifer on streets.
Chairman of the San Diego chapter of the Black Panther Party here, and today what we do is we try to do every other week. What we try to do is do public political education classes, and the topics typically center around a lot of times just perspectives that most people, especially within the community, may not necessarily be aware of, and how to apply those things and that information to your day-to-day lives, and just being conscious of what's actually taking place, especially as it applies to what we get in today's subject matter, because we're talking about psychological operations and conditioning. And oftentimes we all recognize that these things are happening to us, but what we don't realize is the applications and the processes that they shape. And so today we want to get into that, and then by having more of a principled approach and a recognition of what that is, it allows us to better form a defense against it. And so keep that in mind as we build on today's subject matter. So let me go ahead and share the screen here. All right, within the Panther Party, there's several things that we always like to make sure that people are aware of. Within our local objectives, we have what we call the 3Ds. The 3Ds is define, develop, and defend. But also the 3Ps, oftentimes some chapters or some people are not familiar with the 3Ps, which is to perceive, to pursue, and preserve. The reason why this is important is because when we look at critical thinking, and we take a critical approach to addressing any problem and being able to dissect and recognize the difference between a problem and a symptom, we should apply this specific trifactor. And so as an example of that, what you have on the right is to perceive. In order to define something, you have to be able to perceive and have the right perception of what it is that you're defining. Oftentimes what ends up happening to people, whether we're talking about individuals or we're talking about a collective of people, is that our perception has formed our reality. When our perception has formed our reality, and that's a false perception of what's really going on in the world around you, you tend to define your reality based upon your small bubble of perception. So then, based upon you defining your reality with a false narrative, it causes everything that you do that's within those confines to also operate within that false narrative. So what you end up doing throughout the years is you build yourself up to be dysfunctional, which is one of the things we'll be getting into today. I think that word is not used often enough in the community. A lot of the behavior patterns that we have are just flat out dysfunctional, but we don't tend to call them that. We tend to write it off as, off based on the symptoms of trauma, being traumatized. But what comes behind those things are typically what you have defined yourself to be. And so, from that standpoint, it's important for us to be able to recognize that this is what's happening. So, when you're talking about empowering the community, empowering the people through certain forms of consciousness, we have to first and foremost be able to identify how we perceive things. So that's why we say here you must first perceive. And then as you perceive, you can get into defining what is in the best interest of the people. The next one down here, in terms of the right side as well, is we must actively pursue. Why that's important? Because too often we think just because we are aware of a situation, aware of certain forms of damage, certain forms of oppression, that knowledge, quote unquote, is power. You hear that cliche in that said often, but not recognizing what that means. Knowledge is not power until action is applied behind it. So being aware of something, having knowledge of it, does not mean that you will have a defense against it. Nor does that mean that going into where we're getting at, you will develop yourself to be able to protect and have a rational way of addressing it. So we must actively pursue. And then as we actively pursue, based upon that knowledge, then we are able to develop what is in the best interest of the people. But mind you, keep this in mind in terms of the tier process. The first thing that has to happen is the first ones at the top is to perceive and then define. Because if you develop something based upon a false definition, a false narrative, or based upon someone else's game, and you are in an inferior position, then what you are developing is serving them versus serving you or serving your people. So as we actively pursue, we take that knowledge and we utilize that knowledge to be able to develop a sense of defense and offense as it applies to whether it be mental, physical, spiritual, and then you can go psychological, since that's what we're covering today, as well as individual, family, or collective. And it's important that y'all also recognize how things come in threes, because I try to expose people to certain forms of sacred geometry from the standpoint of being able to recognize symbology. Because when you deal with language in itself, especially the English language, it's a lot of spell casting going on, which is where you get the concept spelling. Most of the time we use the words based upon simply them being taught to us, but not understanding the power of words. Since we don't understand the power of words, oftentimes we find ourselves being spell cast just based upon the narrative that has been provided for us, which goes into, again, the definition. So as we reach to gain self-awareness, whether we're talking about any group of people, we have to be able to perceive and then define and then actively pursue in order to develop. And at that point, when you have established that foundation through development, now you must readily preserve what you have been developing. And that's one of the key things that seem to get not given enough attention as we move forward. Those of us that are in grassroots organizations move forward and work on developing, patterns of empowerment for our community, is our ability to preserve it. One of the things that a lot of people don't connect with preserving is what we refer to within the Panther Party as a generational foundational advancement. What that basically means in a nutshell has to do with the fact that what we are doing has to be passed on to the next generation. The knowledge, the wisdom, the techniques gained in terms of what worked and what did not work, which we call lessons learned, has to be passed on to the next generation so that they do not have to repeat the same process, and nor should they have to rediscover the same paths and the same knowledge. So from that standpoint, it's very important that when we preserve, we recognize what preserve means is that we also pass it on to the next, to the next leadership up and coming. And I would say regardless of age, but the bottom line is as people get exposed and based upon their experience level, these are the things that must be dealt with. So you have to train leadership. Just think of it that way. And when we say leadership, it does not necessarily mean somebody that is a specific position or within rank or file for the sake of doing a specific duty. It has to do with the first and foremost, the mindset that I am willing and capable and ready to hold myself accountable for a higher level of work. In other words, it's not just simply putting food on the table as an individual and putting clothes on my back and then developing a immediate family and then sending them off to school. Because constantly what has to go back to being redefined in terms of what we look at as a family unit is our importance and our connection to community. Too often our family structure does not include community. And so therefore, those of us that operate on that level, it tends to be something that we decide to do as a post extracurricular activity, but then those around us may not necessarily see that it should be an obligation that all of us give back to our community. Especially when you go within the Black community and you see that the dollar, or should we say currency, does not really circulate at all. So therefore, we're not building wealth. Therefore, when we talk about building wealth, when we talk about physical, mental, or spiritual wealth, these things, as soon as they come into the community, lead right out. Why? Because we're not dealing with the foundational generational advancement. We're not dealing with the preserving of the knowledge, the information, the wisdom, the experience that should be passed on to each and every one. Therefore, leadership from that standpoint has to do with teaching people to accept accountability as it applies to the condition of their neighborhood, to the condition of their environment, to the condition of their community. And that is the first precursor to what we mean when we talk about leadership. So when you readily preserve, now you have a foundation in terms to defend what is in the best interest of the people. But you have to be able to preserve something so that you have a generation that knows how to defend itself. And again, moving this back in reverse order, and then I keep going. If I do not know how to recognize an enemy, then I cannot have a proper defense against an enemy. So forming a defense requires that you have preserved the generation that's going to be able to continue to fight, develop the right information, the right techniques, the right manner in which you are fighting or you are developing your people, so that when you get down to defending something, you actually have something to defend, and not that it is counter to where you're going. And then obviously, in order to do that, you must be able to actively pursue. And then in order to pursue, we have to have self-definition, which also is termed, when you hear the concept knowledge of self. Having true knowledge of self goes into self-governance, family governance, and community governance. Those three areas as it applies to politics, before you even get on the level of dealing with the general society, as in the republic or democratic system that we deal with overall, that people think about when they think about politics. See, this is why the Black Panther Party, one of the reasons why we refer to everything as politics from that standpoint, because politics is self-governing first and foremost, knowledge of self. If you do not know how to govern self, then when you think you're going to go out and deal with empowering the community, what you're going to find is that you're going to find that you're ill-equipped for battle. You're ill-equipped for the mission that you're attempting to carry out. So therefore, some of the things that you're going to do is going to naturally be a disservice to the actual mission that you intend on doing. That's one of the biggest things about that, is when we don't apply proper formula based upon experience, based upon in-depth study, and just based upon us coming together and sharpening each other in terms of who we are and what we are and why we're fighting, then what happens is you end up running circles. You end up on this hamster wheel, so to speak, and you may make a little gain, but then the conditions never change, which is why we're talking about psychological conditions. So since the conditions never change, all you're dealing with is a lot of times individual fights, but you're not making systematic changes, and you're not able to address things from the standpoint to where when victories are won, they can be concreted so that the next generation or next Panther society or any grassroots organization does not have to fight that exact same fight and rediscover the whole process of getting to that point that you've already been. So, in saying all of that, this is super important for those of y'all that are Panthers and may have seen this in the membership manual and heard of the 3Ds and the 3Ps. I just wanted to break that down as well as to the public, the general public, break those things down because again, when we talk about spell casting, when we talk about the use of words in the language that we use, it is super important that that is defined as you get started. So with that being said, it establishes a framework in which the things that we're going to talk about can take place. Do I have any questions, real quick questions before we move on in regards to that?
Um,
I think Bunchy raised his hand. Go ahead, brother Bunchy.
it's not so much a question as it is a statement. As you were going over all of that, I kept hearing in my head, this is like the literal, um, somebody literally expounding on Huey's definition of power, being that the definition of power is to be able to define a phenomenon and make it act in a desired manner. This is absolutely like taking that definition and expanding it to make it make sense to a person who may not be able to comprehend it. So, yeah, that's dope. Thank you.
Thank you for that observation. And see, again, that's what's important because oftentimes we can read a manual, we can read certain things that has been passed on, but we have to be able to put it in perspective. And so, as we do that for each other, that helps us to be able to deal with being able to readily preserve. So let's go into now the concept of what we're talking about: psychological conditioning of a people. In order to do that, we must first set the framework of what we mean by conditioning. So, what is conditioning? A process of changing behavior by rewarding or punishing a subject each time an action is performed until that subject associates that action with pleasure or distress. And what's very important about that in establishing that recognition of what conditioning is that once these behavior patterns are established, what they do within the body is form neural nets. A lot of times, a lot of us are not familiar with the power of the brain and what happens when things are learned, when behaviors are learned. From this standpoint, once the brain has been conditioned, certain neural links are connected, and those neural links are connected based upon actions that are experiences that take place. Every time you have a repetitive experience that meets those same frameworks, what happened is now the body gets into what we also call, from a physical standpoint, muscle memory. That muscle memory causes it to not have to experience the same set of actions in order to know an outcome. The problem with that, when we'll get into this further when we talk about weaponization, is the fact that, and one of the best examples I like to use on this goes into the project MK Ultra. A lot of people familiar with the project, but very few people have actually read the mountains of case work and examples of experimentations that were going on with it. What was really learned from that had a lot to do with just the power of taking hold of a mind, the power of manipulating society through the most subtle means of subjugation. So when we talk about the conditioning, this goes into the fact that certain things are fed to the brain and it causes a certain behavior that does not have to be, and most often is not, a conscious reaction. So therefore, it slips past our defense system, that when we talked about defining what is in the best interest. Since we didn't recognize that enemy, that weapon that was being used against us, we don't have a proper defense because it slipped right by us. That's what's important about what we talk about when we deal with this aspect of conditioning. The next part of that is what is psychological, pertaining to or dealing with or affecting the mind, especially as a function of awareness, feelings, or motivation. And the key thing here is a function of awareness, feelings, and motivation. So when you deal with the functionality of awareness or the functionality of feelings, which goes into emotion, and the functionality of motivation, which is your reward system, recognize that three trifactor, because a lot of people are not seeing that: awareness, feeling, and motivation. That particular trifactor goes into when we talk about the functionality of psychological control. You're either dealing with people through their awareness or lack of awareness, through their emotions, which bypass the logic, which goes into awareness, and then your system of rewards, which deals with the motivation, which creates that drive or creates that interest or that appetite, as we deal with sometimes the appetite for you to be able to do more, or should I say, even escape what's going on. So motivation is not always a positive thing. Motivation can be negative or it can be positive. You know, when you think of motivation from that standpoint, think of what it is that drives you to take action against or for something. So what motivates you from that standpoint? And again, a lot of times when we talk about this from a psychological standpoint, we're dealing with muscle memory. So in addressing that, now we have to deal with these two words being brought together. So to combine the two words bring us to a situation that opens up the gate to mental weaponization. So mental weaponization now goes into the meat of why we're discussing what we're discussing, so that you can recognize the operations of psychological conditioning. If the manner in which life is lived becomes weaponized, life is used as a weapon or made into a weapon. In the context of our discussion, weapons are needed in order to do battle. Those that engage in battle are called combatants. So when the way in which humanity is foundational becomes the source of its own demise, a perpetual cycle is formed. Let me stop right there real quick and simply talk about the idea again of weaponization and how the individual, the mind becomes weaponized and our process become weaponized. And by us being out in a situation of being weaponized, again, the key point there is that you are now a combatant. See, what happens is most of us do not identify with the fact that, especially engaging in a society to where we are typically born oppressed. Now, let me draw more perspective on that so we don't think that it's just simply talking about overall slavery or talking about what happened in the past. I'm talking about an active thing that goes on now, psychologically, what happens to a population, and even more so to specific populations. But in essence, the populations and the masses of people are weaponized, period. And what we mean by that is things that are oftentimes portrayed and oftentimes projected upon a society forms a condition that allows the people to be pinned against each other. When you have a capitalistic, for instance, a capitalistic environment to where it's dog eat dog, or like they say, every man for themselves, these little things that they put in there, it causes division. Those divisions, to some degree in a market, create a mobility or upward development. But at the same time, what it does overall to society is it creates a situation to where we are all combatants against one another. And by being busy being combatants against one another, those that have put us in this rat race, or those that have created and constructed or orchestrated the game itself, are removed from the rules of the game, removed from that whole environment. And so they are placed at a level to where they are able to continually control what's going on, which is why we talk about the idea of creating a perpetual cycle, which I get into next. So if you don't recognize that you are a combatant, then you will not know that you are at war. And if you don't know that you're at war, then you would not know that you need to defend yourself against a situation. Therefore, you would not recognize where you are being used as a weapon, or recognize that you need to have weapons, because again, you don't know that you're on a battlefield. Oftentimes, our recognition of oppression comes off as trauma. It comes off as an emotional perspective, an emotional point of view. So we tend to do what we refer to within our mechanism structure, cope and denial, the two negative aspects of our mechanisms. And so when you are coping with life, you are not living life, you are now in survival mode. And so when we're in a situation where what we're doing is coping with life, then we are not removing obstacles, but we are learning to navigate and live in the best way possible within a condition of being oppressed, within a condition of these. It's like basically saying, well, there's an obstacle. What are we taught to do? Jump over it or go around it and keep it moving, keep it moving. But see, that's what an obstacle course is. The idea is to be able to condition you to navigate and continue to go forward and be able to get the best time with coping with those obstacles, but not removing the obstacles. So we're familiar with that from a physical standpoint. And when we think about that, we think about physical conditioning, obstacle courses. And also from a mental conditioning, obstacle courses are placed, especially within a military construct, in order to harden the soldier so that a soldier can fight a war without a cause. And especially when you're dealing with a young mind, which is why the age of 18, 19, 17, 18, and 19 is the perfect ages to make somebody a combatant, a direct combatant in a war. Because is if you numb them properly and you weaponize them, then they do not necessarily care about the fight. They're stimulated and motivated, going back to those that trifactor, they're stimulated and motivated through the actual sheer movement of what's going on. So then when you take them on a obstacle course and teach them to cope, and teach them to cope at high speeds and high levels, and constantly do work their best measure of coping, let's apply that now to the average citizen and the average person in terms of what they go through just obtaining and dealing with a 9 to 5. We're taught to cope. We're taught that this is what happens. This is what society is. Everybody has to do their part. So from a psychological standpoint, you are coping with a condition that is contrary to liberation and freedom as it applies to a people. Why? Because we're talking about the masses at this point. And in order to deal with governing the masses, you have to have a system of control, which goes into social engineering. So a lot of us don't recognize it for what it really is. If you look at the document I'm sharing, hopefully y'all can recognize that behind it is the all-seeing eye. And the reason why that's in the background is to emphasize the fact that behind whatever is being said and behind whatever is being provided to you stands in the shadow, stands that hidden light that is looking straight at you in the middle of the page. So we have to be used to symbology and how it is applied, period. So now let's go into the idea here and breakdown of perpetual and the perpetual cycles. Let's see, where would I have? Okay, to the untrained, the word perpetual and cycle sounds like an oxymoron, but let's re-examine both words for the sake of clarity. Perpetual, never ending or changing, no loss in energy. For those people that may be in the engineering fields, you may be familiar with the concept of perpetual energy machines, or what they call free energy machines, and how within quantum physics they talk about how that is basically impossible, because there's no way for something to not have a loss of energy. But the point here, especially as it applies to mental constructs and psychological constructs, is that you have to see that the perpetual concept is something that is never ending, right? And does not have a loss of energy. So now let's go into what a cycle is: a series of events that are regularly repeated in the same order, which gets you to the point of no loss in sequence. which meaning the pattern itself, no matter what is going on, going back to the concept of what we talked about with the obstacles, no matter what's going on, there is no loss in sequence. So then when you put the two words together and deal with perpetual cycles, and we talk about this from the standpoint of warfare, we are creating a conditioned people that generates a what we call a self-fulfilling prophecy or self-fulfilling operation. So therefore, once I have interjected this form of warfare as the controller or as the elite force or as the designer or the architect, I can now step back and allow my creation to perpetually put itself in a cycle of a repeated pattern, of a repeated condition of dysfunctionality, and they will maintain themselves and maintain that core essence of that dysfunction and move forward without my input. And this is in essence what we see happening all the time, but we don't recognize it for what it is, which is why I am explaining the concept of perpetual cycle to y'all and getting you to realize that it is a weaponized way of life. And so this is real key that we pick up on that, because unless we pick up on that and see it for what it is, again, going back to how we started, define, develop, and defend. We are not able to form a defense if we don't recognize that we have been weaponized to be the actual weapon against one another. This goes into certain things where we can see how, for instance, pretty much most of y'all are familiar with the concept of the Willie Lynch syndrome. Think of the Willie Lynch concept in terms of the applications of weaponizing a people against itself as a classic example of everything that we're talking about. That's just an example. But in using that example, it talks about within the Willie Lynch writings of putting lighter skin against darker skin, pinning the field slave against the house slave. It create what we call polarizations. Polarizations, again, talking about when we deal with the sacred geometry again, now we're talking about twos, things that come in twos, which also goes into the two of the perpetual and the cycle, how these things come together. So that's dealing with polarization as well. So it's important that we recognize the processes that are being exposed to us when we talk about things being polarized, or we talk about the trifactor or the trinity. Within one aspect of the trinity that most people are familiar with but don't understand the essence of how it came to be, we talk about the trinity of the Godhead, or in the Father, so to speak, and then the Son. So, and in Christianity they call it, and I'm getting lost of words, but in Christianity it is, you have Jesus, you got the Father, and then you got the Holy Ghost, so to speak, which forms that Trinity. Most of us don't recognize that for being a trifactor or a part of a conditioning that goes into mental warfare, that also goes into what I said when we talk about physical, mental, and spiritual, or we talk about the individual, the family, and the collective, which is the rebirthing process. Okay, so when we deal with threes from that standpoint, that is what's happening. But if we're not able to see that, then we're not able to form a defense that is able to deal with the knowledge that we've been exposed to, which is why I said earlier, knowledge is not power if there's nothing done with it. Just having the awareness of something does not empower you to be able to make change. That's just one of the first aspects and first steps. But there's way more amount of access of information that we all have that we don't ever apply, especially in this information age. We're basically inundated with data. So again, dealing with the perpetual cycle, this is how the overall aspect of what we're dealing with goes into weaponization. So let's talk about this here in a concept here, a greater definition level. The linkage is to create a regenerative pattern, which is what I talked about earlier. The regenerative pattern, that's the terminology there, that adapts to the environment in order to repeat the same process. With this understanding, regardless of the generation, the destructive nature, which is the foundation, remains intact. So the people have been conditioned to carry the legacy of dysfunction. So to break that down a little bit further, what we're talking about is how the perpetual cycle is embedded within a society or embedded within a person. That person then raises their family based upon the initial seeding of a dysfunction. As they raise a family through that dysfunctionality, they form a community behind that dysfunctionality. That community pins itself against the next community, and then that community pins itself against the next family, which goes and ties into the next individual. So it just is a perpetual cycle of dysfunctionality. It is a weapon that is self-fulfilling at that point. And what we're talking about again is mental, physical, and spiritual warfare. And we're talking about it from a principled approach because too often we do not recognize that that is in essence what's happening. Any questions or comments before we move on? Oh, also, I do want to let it be known that if you put it in the chat group, your email in the chat group, I will email you a copy of this document. I think it's important that, not only do you or that people, listen, but also have handwritten material that you can refer back to. Because what's the point of exposing you to this if you're not going to be able to be empowered and again pass it on to the next generation or the next person? So we have to be able to break these cycles so the next movement does not have to repeat the same discoveries. Because when we do that, we never get to what I refer to as being able to outpace the pace of oppression. From a mathematical standpoint, even though we're talking about small numbers in any way, but as it applies to that, if whatever I'm doing is not able to multiply its efforts and not multiply its gain, then I'm fighting a completely losing battle. And so we have to go into the natural process of replication, period. Okay, so since we don't have any questions, I keep moving here. Next slide here. All right, so by not knowing its true function, a disconnect is embedded in the collective knowledge cycle. That's important, collective knowledge cycle, because when we talk about a collective knowledge cycle, that is different than the individual or the family knowledge cycle. But a collective knowledge cycle has to do with the fact that I may create a condition that can get passed on from the individual through the family that does not actually create an implosion until it gets to the community level. This is how oftentimes things like that, what we're talking about, escape the average person. Again, we may have a sense of awareness, but it escapes your ability to have a proper defense against it because you don't know when that weapon is being utilized. Keep in mind, especially as it applies to a military doctrine, oftentimes it is not the knowledge of a weapon that makes it top secret, but the applications. And that's what we tend to forget, is that the applications of psychological conditioning have to be defined. Because if we can't define them, we cannot form a weapon. And if you can't form a weapon, that means you can't, again, prevent it. And if you can't prevent it, guess what? The next generation is going to be faced with the same exact thing. And even though you may have individual victories, are you collectively able to take on and eradicate the actual obstacle versus cope with it and just get more hardened as to accept what it is? So when we talk about this here, embedded in a collective knowledge cycle, I just wanted to get y'all to key in on the collective knowledge cycle. As individuals, this pattern is viewed as an awareness, like I said, but the larger the group, the less the awareness or ability to see the fractal reality. This is defined as the monkey mind. Now, let me break down, well, I guess I do break it down a little later, when we talked about the fractal mentality or reality. So that's important here, the fractal reality. So, but let me go into what the monkey mind is. So monkey mind, the human mind is being fully, constantly screeching, fighting, chattering, distracted, white noise energy, creating mental chaos. As people with anxiety disorder, stress issues, or other difficult habits of mind will testify, it often seems like we are constantly at war with our brains. This goes into, especially now, this goes into what we see happening with this current generation as it applies to how much social media influences people. It creates this dynamic to where people are less capable of dealing with stress and levels of stress. Why? Because we're moving into a technological usage that has us dealing with things which creates what we call instant gratification. You can ask this thing called Siri a question, and it's going to give you an answer back right away. No research was needed. And so, since no research was needed, you obtaining an answer was instantaneous. That comes into your, again, where we first started about the psychological conditioning that creates a situation to where your neural nets now expects answers immediately. So when I am removed from the reality of this world to where a lot of our problems cannot be solved or given an answer given to you in terms of where to go and address it right away, psychologically, I'm not built for that anymore. So therefore, I have a higher tendency to have explosive behavioral patterns because I want things to happen instantly. And so these things are happening to us a lot of times subconsciously, and we don't recognize these dysfunctional behavior patterns. And so the ability, or should I say, the likeliness that we will implode and explode upon one another becomes greater because we're not forming a defense around it, because the technology that we're using is outpacing our mental, what we call emotional content, content. And since it outpaces our emotional content, we're not capable of really grasping and utilizing the technology to our benefit. But that technology is actually hindering our overall ability to critically think as a collective people. And that's what's super important, because if we don't recognize that, then we fall victim to it over and over and over again. There is a branch of psychology called cyber psychology that I would suggest all of y'all look up. In fact, I think I want to say I talked about that on the last public class, so it may be on the Panther 48 channel. If y'all are not familiar with that, you can go to the Panther 48 channel and watch a lot of the past videos that public videos that we've done. So dealing with cyber psychology, it basically talks about a lot of the pitfalls and damages and destructions that come about as a result of our dependence, our codependence on the virtual reality, and our codependence on social media, and how it separates us from the reality in which we live. So people end up living two lives, and they fall in love with the virtual life, which causes it to form more of a disconnect with the real reality in which they have to operate on a day-to-day basis. So they can't wait to get off their 9 to 5 that they don't like, so that they can go into this virtual world and create this basically this shield against reality, and I can be whoever I want to be in that world, and I can watch everyone else. And from that standpoint, you create this fictitious persona that is not really able to exist in a real life situation. So that is kind of a whole nother subject into itself, but I did at least want to explain and expose y'all to how that connects to the monkey mind. So now when we talk about fractal reality, the ability to see each part having the same statistical characteristic as the whole. Fractal patterns reoccur at all scales of geometric language. And that's another coin terminology I would suggest y'all look up and get familiar with: geometric language. So while most people have heard of fractals, the ability to embody the deeper relationship our lives have tend to not have a useful place in codifying our true nature in universal balance. So the partly random or chaotic phenomenon such as crystal growth, fluid turbulence, snowflakes, eroded coastlines, and galaxy formations is not known, although each one shares the same perpetual cycle that is used against us every day. And that's the key. That when we talk about fractal reality, this is a science, this is not science fiction. This is reality. This is reality. This goes into especially the macrocosm and the microcosm of how order is sustained, which again, once you can identify those patterns, now if you apply that to a weaponized format, and you apply it to being able to deal with behavioral patterns, which is what we're talking about when we get into psychological conditioning, you find this perfect little weapon or perfect little niche that you can use against a population, and it becomes what we refer to as a silent weapon. And by it being a silent weapon, it is able to be embedded within the society that it was deployed on, and they are not able to typically form a defense against it because they don't see it happening. They don't see themselves setting themselves up for this this perpetual cycle to happen over and over and over again, which creates that whole aspect of dysfunctionality, which is why younger generations tend to think certain aspects of personal individual liberation contrary to what the collective needs in terms of addressing what we're talking about here as we talk about a society on a path of self-destruction. Because what we have to realize, especially those of us that are in grassroots movements in dealing with fighting oppression, is that there is a separation of personal oppression from collective oppression. The collective oppression that we're talking about oftentimes is able to remain hidden as it applies to personal fights of oppression, because those things are individually based. Those things don't involve the harnessing and the sheepling of a society and of a people, because it does not exist in a recognizable format on an individual level. Because from that standpoint, especially here in the United States, is promoted as you having the ability to pursue happiness, pursue. So being able to have this pursuit also ties directly into what I said about the rat race. You keep you busy the mind. You create enough white noise background environment to where the carrier frequency itself becomes enticing and becomes the appetite or the thing that soothes you. Therefore, the actual message that's hidden within that carrier is able to transverse great distances. And so this happens again, physically, mentally, and spiritually, as it applies to what's going on with us. So that fractal reality is a way that we can see this pattern naturally occurring in nature, but then apply this from a weaponization standpoint as it applies to how a group of people can be used against each other. So that's where the monkey bond came in. So now going on to the next thing, this emulation becomes dissimulation for the sake of keeping us blind from the formula of solution to problem placement. That is a real big one, and this is one that most of y'all may be familiar with just in general politics, but you might not necessarily know, again, the applications of how and when it is often used on so many levels. So in breaking that down, solution to problem placement is a strategy of creating a problem in order to provide a solution. To the target, the solution comes across as a savior and is accepted as a real need. Because the target is not aware of the initial cause, they embrace the options provided and give away their ability to make choice. This is also referred to as an exchange of freedoms for liberties. Now, a whole lot was said right there. And again, I would advise y'all and urge y'all to make sure you put your email in the group and get this document and go back and just marinate on it. Marinate on the things that you're being exposed to if you're not familiar with it. But from a politics standpoint, most of us are aware of the fact that oftentimes big brother, so to speak, or corporate, or the corporate elite create problems, but they suppress the fact that they created the problem, and they provide you a solution, because on a mass level, we need something done. We don't care how it happened at that point. The bottom line is fix it. When at the end of the day, we just want it fixed. And sometimes we want to be able to place a blame on somebody. And typically, once somebody is blamed for it, then we feel okay with the fact that they got quote unquote justice done to them. And that's referred to, especially in satanic circles, or as the scapegoat. That's the Baphomet. So that's a whole nother subject matter. But the point I'm getting at from that is that having a scapegoat tends to allow weapons to be deployed more frequently and across the board, without the actual process of how they was weaponized being brought out, which would stop the actual ones that created the problem in the first place, because it's often the ones that provided you the solution that created the problem. But they have a scapegoat to hide and cloak their trail of guilt, their trail leading back to them. And as long as we see somebody paying for the crime, no matter how much of it has been deployed, then we think, okay, well, justice has been done. Let's just keep moving with our life, which goes into the concept of coping, because we're not getting down to the root cause of the problem, or the root cause of what created the problem, which therefore means we can't have a real solution. The solution that was presented to you was the one for that identified problem, but not the actual cycle that creates the problems, that continues to create new problems through new weather patterns, psychological weather patterns. So in other words, it may look like a dog today, or a cat tomorrow, or a pigeon the day after that, but you are still dealing with a fractal reality and a cycle that will not change until you get to the root cause of what is creating these problems. So I hope y'all are still with me on where I'm going. Anybody got any questions so far? Okay, Doc, raise your hand. Go ahead, Doc.
Yeah, so I had a couple thoughts. So when you're talking about technology, social media, stuff like that, and the way that it traps us in this pattern, so I've just been thinking a lot about an essay Karl Marx wrote recently called "The End of Capital," where he describes the idea that at a certain point, the accomplishments of the worker, the more that we produce, the more things we make, the more new things we create, the more we are immiserated and destroyed. And that made me think about that, because what we're essentially, not only are we trapped in this like rat race obstacle course like you're talking about, where we're convinced that to get ahead we have to keep pushing and pushing and pushing harder, just within this system, but the more that we do that, the more that we're creating the tools of our own destruction. And then I also, what you just said about this idea of a scapegoat, and the way that we're, in order to accept the solution to a problem, we are willing to sacrifice our freedoms, and we're willing to allow things to be weaponized against us. I was thinking about the way that, after January 6th, the Biden administration creates this new anti-terrorism definition and task force memo thing, but what they're actually going after, when you read it, who the people that are actually going to be the most criminalized by this are revolutionary organizations. Mm-hmm. So that was just an example I thought of. Yeah.
Thank you. One thing I want you to also take into account, based upon the examples you're given, is keep an eye on people like Elon Musk, especially as it applies to how all of the different technologies that he's developing overlap one another, to the point to where it literally creates this encompassing overall structure that has the ability to deal with world domination, which creates also a position to where a new type of currency or a new type of reward system has to be put into place which will eliminate our need to have 9 to 5s. That's why with what he's doing with the robot that's being developed, the idea is that it will replace the need for the labor force. And as a result of that, there is a form of currency, or a form of, I guess, exchange in the works of being developed, so that the people can still sustain themselves. But what is this creating in terms of codependency? So I just wanted to just throw that out there. Brother Adu, you got your hand up, and then Cole after that.
How you doing, Brother War?
A lot of people.
All power, brother. So a couple of the things that you mentioned. So the monkey mind aspect. Brother Token put it in the chat earlier that it sounded like TikTok, and Doc just mentioned it as well, that social media is weaponized to keep that monkey mind aspect. And that's a similar thought that I had, but taking it even a step further than that and bringing it back to something that you said even earlier around recognizing a problem or obstacle and wanting an immediate answer rather than actually being able to sit down and identify your problem. I mean, me personally, when I'm able to sit, analyze my problem and go through it, I start to recognize that this isn't as extreme as I initially thought. It was my initial like rapid movement that kind of oversold the issue, or like I made it more extreme than I needed to. And being able to sit down and analyze that, said, okay, now I can do A, B, and C to effectively combat this. And using that monkey mind aspect that can be weaponized against us in that fashion to say, okay, if we're giving them an immediate solution, even if it's the wrong solution, but we paint it as the right thing, it gives them that motivation to continue moving, and it gives them it makes it to where they're not able to stop and think. They're just like, okay, now I can move forward again. And it's movement it's almost blind movement. It's movement without sight.
That's exactly it. You basically said the same thing I've already said. You're just putting it in your language, but you're saying the same thing.
It's Bunchy said it earlier. This is absolutely crazy. Thank you so much for this. But yeah, I just that weaponization of the monkey mind versus us is it's a new theory, and I have something that I'm working on that I'll throw to you at the end, but because I want to keep going on this and see if it impacts in any way. But just thank you for this, and that thought process was very interesting to me.
Okay, let me say one point, and then Cole and then B Token, y'all are last two, and then we need to move on. But let me make one point clear. And it was stated this way intentionally, and we can't exchange the words. I said that you get exposed to an instantaneous answer, not an instantaneous solution. Oftentimes we exchange in our mind, answer equals solution. Oh, I got it now. Most of the time when you get an answer, it is not a solution. By getting answers, we have been conditioned to feel like, okay, emotional content, feel like an answer is a solution. So typically we move on an answer because someone was able to give you an answer. They must know what's really happening, what's going on. Oftentimes answers are not the same thing as solutions at all. So then now we're being misled. Now we're being, again, guided down a direction that puts us, why I referenced a hamster wheel. Because I gave you an answer. So dealing with double talk in terms of politics is a way to get used to being able to provide somebody an answer right away. Politicians do it all the time. A lot of times we can see through it simply because we may know the issue. But just apply that again across the board to what we're talking about how something can be invisible on two tiers, but not the third tier in terms of that trifactor. Go ahead, Brother Cole.
Yeah, good to see you again, Brother War. My question is kind of two-parter. The first one is, is it fair in your discussion of just now what you were saying, like the answer that they give us, and also that they glorify as being the end-all be-all to society? Is it safe to just assume, I think kind of Doc hinted as well, under a material analysis, that answer is consumed in this society? Is that kind of what you're hinting at?
Rephrase that again. I want to make sure I answer your question right. Just say it all again. I want to make sure I get you able to give you a solution or interpret what you're saying.
Sure thing. So based on the material and analysis of what you just said, of being provided this answer to like satiate our monkey brain, and being granted or like presented this answer as the end all be all for our society, is it safe to say that the answer we're being presented in our material world as Americans, especially as working class Americans of color, is consumption? We're presented consumption as the end all be all answer to keep moving forward on that treadmill of production.
Okay, let me say it like this. From that standpoint, I wouldn't call that the answer. What I call that is the vehicle. So the vehicle of consumption has to do with a lifestyle that is based upon creating the weaponization. So the difference between saying the answer has to do with you identifying a path that gets you closer to whatever objective you have. The answer itself may apply to the individual or to the family, but it does not translate into a solution when you get to the community. So the thing that we're dealing with here is how perception comes into play. That's why we started off at the very first top thing that we talked about was how things are perceived. Because going back down to the two trifactors that we had on both sides, right at the very beginning, if you start off wrong, which again, like I said, we're born into certain levels of oppression. So if you start off wrong, everything starts zigzagging, and I said that intentionally, zigzagging to a degree to where by the time you receive an answer, or by the time you think you recognize a path, your perception has been warped to the point to where you're going to be on that hamster wheel, meaning you're not able to critically think and really get to a point of a solution. Let me give you another example here of words that was used that y'all might did not pick up on. The difference between choice and option. Oftentimes people don't recognize that they're not one and the same. We tend to give away our choice and accept the best options. This especially plays itself out in day-to-day governmental politics all the time, which is why people typically vote for the lesser of two evils. That is basically accepting the options laid before you. Whereas having choice basically means that you don't have to pick either one. It's like if I were to say to someone, just as a general question within a group, go left, or would you go left, or would you go right? What's the answer to that, Cole?
It depends on what context, what are my material conditions.
Thank you. You at least recognize and saw through that. You have no idea how many times I say that to somebody and they decide one of them. They pick one. And typically it's because we have given away our choice, or we don't have the ability to be able to see that we don't have everything within our capabilities to actually make a decision. But because we want to be caught up, going back to what you said, in instantaneous answers, we want to hurry up and get it over with. So our logic has us trapped in this mode to where I need to give an answer right now. I need to make a decision right now. I need to keep it moving. This is why when I stated earlier, when we talked about obstacles, the idea here is to keep you moving faster and faster and faster achieving over those obstacles, you get to a point to where, kind of going back to what you said, to where you're moving so fast that you don't recognize that you're creating the self-fulfilling condition of your own impoverished lifestyle, your own impoverished views. And again, going to what we talk about, mental, physical, or spiritual, you start destroying or you putting yourself in a self-destructive path. But all along, you think that because you're getting over the obstacle faster, that you are solving something. So you got misdirected and misidentified what's really happening. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. I guess that kind of leads way into my second question then. If you presuppose a sort of societal understanding, because that is what being a revolutionary party kind of presupposes, is that society will eventually make that awakening and make that great change. Like we're seeing in the global South, why do you think it is that we're seeing such like a red wave in Latin America in these moments, and you know, across Africa and Asia, and yet at this like very moment in America, we're still on that treadmill, like refusing, like you said, to even acknowledge that we're in the war, that we even have to defend ourselves. And just as a side note, I wanted to commend that statement so much. It just really reminded me of Malcolm X statement of like, you know, the white man has the knife in our back, but won't even admit it's there. We've kind of come so far that large swaths of society are at war and don't even realize they're there. But why do you think that is here in America, whereas we're seeing in the global South, that's no longer being the case?
I would say this really goes back to what I talked about earlier in terms of the fact that we tend to think that when, as revolutionaries, as grassroots organizers, that by simply exposing people or showing people what's wrong will actually get them to awaken or get them to make movement on it, which is why we talked earlier about the idea of actively pursuing. In other words, think of it like this. How do I get a person to want to hold themselves accountable for their immediate society, their immediate surroundings? See, if we can't create, and the thing of a revolutionary is we have to spark and create the altitude and the appetite for the people to want to rise up. Not simply rise up because of recognizing the conditions, because what the mistake we're making is that we think simply because people recognize that they're being oppressed, that they're going to actively make change toward that oppression. No, because what happens is, again, this is why we talked about the cope and then the denial mechanism. What actually happens is they fortify themselves to be able to conditionally manipulate around that obstacle instead of removing the obstacle. So in other words, you see a log in the road, you jump over it or you go around it, but you keep it moving. Not thinking about the fact that, well, if I move that log out the road, that's one element of oppression that those behind me would not have to deal with. We're not paving a way that creates a process of, like I stated earlier, of outpacing the pace of oppression. In other words, they continue to lay logs and we continue to jump faster, to jump higher, to learn how to maneuver around it. But what we're not doing is eliminating that from the battlefield. So as a revolutionary, we have to be aware of what we call not just strategy, not just tactics, but we call conduit. And I hope y'all have been exposed to that, but you have strategy, you have your conduit, and you have your tactics. Oftentimes people only know about strategy and tactics, but they don't know about the conduit or the conduction that has to take place to merge the two together. Because you have to take the polarity and make it a trifactor. And so that conduit and that process of getting from one to the next is often lost upon the people. So then society repeats the same mistakes over and over again, which is why I stated earlier that we have to get away from get things getting lost and the next generation having to rediscover it. And so we're not at a pace of addressing oppression. just from a basic mathematical point of view, is that you'll never catch up with it or never get yourself magnified or multiplied to the point to where you will be rendered to be effective. Let B Token go ahead, and then we need to move on.
Good day, good day. So a lot of what I had to ask had to do with what you were just talking about exactly, is because a lot of what I've been trying to figure out within, like, coming into understanding things is there a way to necessarily use this weaponization to our benefit against ourselves, like against our own conditioning, by conditioning ourselves as the masses to then, instead of jumping over these logs, we condition ourselves to see the logs as something, to cut the house with, not, or cut up and build a house with. So like, is there overall, like, is there necessarily a solution in like a layman's terms, in a sense of like the strategic goal to the solution, to use that weaponization to our benefit, to then weaponize that very conditioning to de-weaponize it?
Yes, there is. In fact, what you're talking about, we get into on page number 6. So just keep your question and recognize that. So, and let me just say this without going into that before we get to that, is that the way this stuff is being presented to you is for you to absorb the principles. Because once you absorb the principles, then you don't have to memorize, so to speak, what is taking place. Because in order for you to be able to use this, let's just take it from the standpoint of a martial science, or what people call martial arts. Once you have a technique down, once you have your kata down, once you have a method down that actually defends you against a specific strike, it becomes what, again, muscle memory. That muscle memory is what we have to be able to have. The problem, again, goes right back to what we said at the very beginning, which has to do with whether or not you had the right perception and whether or not you defined your reality, which goes into knowledge of self. Because if you start on the wrong path and you do not make the proper connection or proper repair, and then go back and recover, then you're gonna mess up and fumble the ball on everything else. And I think maybe that's what I should have said in order for us to see how we are able to form that defense, is that when you identify a mistake in the direction, you have to take a step back and regroup so that you can make sure that your perception and your definition equates to fighting oppression correctly, and then go back forward. Oftentimes we think we reach this point of no return in terms of just maybe our physical amount of time we got on the battlefield, and we want so bad to see a certain level of victory that we're unwilling to unlearn a wrong process in order to be able to move forward and make a correction for the next generation to benefit. This is why we say foundational generational advancement. That is so that the current generation that is fighting the fight will accept the fact that they may not see the victories that they want to see in their lifetime, but that they set the proper mold so that the next generation, again, does not have to fight and rediscover the same thing that they was unwilling to go take a step back from and apply properly. So let me keep moving with that being said. So it sounds like y'all definitely getting some stuff out of this. So in regards to dealing with the solution to the problem placement, we deal with what we call mind cleansing, which is invoking of redefining your appetite to embrace a higher quantitative content. This goes back really into kind of like starting to answer the question you just asked. versus what we call brainwashing. Now, when we talk about mind cleansing, again, you want to redefine the appetite of the people. So once you redefine the appetite of the people, then they are willing to take on a diet that is nutritious to the sake of revolution, nutritious to the sake of having solutions as opposed to just answers. So we have to work at developing the appetite. In a nutshell, the manipulation that we're talking about has to be applied in a progressive approach as well. So don't get it twisted into think that anytime you are influencing the people, that it is not a form of manipulation. The word manipulation does not have to be a bad word. And I think that's part of the part of the things that we try to dance around oftentimes, is that we tend to feel like certain things, we don't want to call it what it is. And we feel like it's been, since it's been defined for us and we've accepted that definition, then we're afraid to, again, recodify it, as we stated earlier, to suit where we're going. And when you think of guerrilla warfare, let's just think of guerrilla warfare as it applies to reaching our people. By any means necessary, should we be willing to get where we need to go. And what that means is, if our people have been manipulated and to their demise, we have to manipulate them to their to raising their consciousness. Okay, it's you have to do a form of mind cleansing, right? And everybody knows what a cleanse is when it applies to the physical body, but oftentimes we're not applying that across the trifactor. Okay, we're willing to cleanse our physical body, but we need to cleanse our mind and we need to cleanse our spirit too. And then by doing so, the proper appetite will be readily available for higher, again, to embrace higher quantitative content. And as we move on, again, like I said, a section down, we'll start to see why that's not the case, to where our people don't naturally have the proper appetite. So let me keep moving here on the next one. Okay, so classical conditioning stages. It's important that we recognize the stages in which this happens. So stage one, which is before the conditioning. In this stage, the unconditioned stimulus produce an unconditioned response in an organism. In basic terms, this means that the stimulus in the environment has produced a behavior response which is unlearned, and therefore is a natural response which has not yet been taught. In this respect, no new behavior has been learned yet. This stage also involves another stimulus which has no effect on a person, and is also called a neutral stimuli. And I know that kind of seemed weird, but in terms of what was being stated, but just to break it down, it's about setting the right atmosphere so that the process of conditioning can be drafted up. So oftentimes it's like, think of it as a person walking out on a battlefield, but not yet knowing that they're on the battlefield. Or to give you a real good example that exists in nature, and I'm sure everybody's familiar with this. You can take a pot of cold water, put it on a stove, drop some frogs in it, and gradually turn up the water, the heat. And by the time the frog recognizes that they are in hot water, their muscles have stiffened and contracted to the point to where they can't hop out of the water. You created a battlefield condition that allowed things to be subtle. So by the time the people recognize it to actually be something that is threatening for them, it is too late for them to form a defense against it. And when we say that, let's go back to the whole idea that we talked earlier about the perpetual cycle. Not to say that it's too late for them to ever free themselves of that situation, but you have created a perpetual cycle. So oftentimes somebody from the outside that has identified and see what's actually happened has to come in and extract them from that situation. They have to be removed from this environment that they've created. And that's called the hood mentality in another sense. The next one here, stage 2, during conditioning. During this stage, the stimuli which produces no response, which is aka neutral, is associated with an unconditioned stimuli, at which point it now becomes known as the conditioned stimulus. For classical condition to be effective, the conditioned stimulus should occur before the unconditional stimulus rather than after it, or during the same time. Thus, the conditioned stimulus acts as a type of signal or cue for the unconditioned stimuli. This also goes back into what we call mental seeding. Mental seeding is when I interject or create a picture, but have not yet put you in a position to where that picture, that mental picture, has a definitive image. Okay, we also refer to it as subliminal intrusive thought. So from that standpoint, I've just implanted or I've seeded you with something that at a later date is going to be able to work against you. You may not recognize it, but it's been planted in the proper soil so that at a later date it can be deployed. So that's how you deal with during the condition. And now stage 3. Which goes into what we call after conditioning. Now the conditioned stimuli has been associated with an unconditioned stimulus to create a new conditional response. So from that standpoint, basically, now that seed has germinated and sprouted, and the weather pattern or the watering of it, which basically means what I start exposing you to with through a school system, is going to reflect what I've already put inside of you before you even got into kindergarten. So from that standpoint, it is going to now start working itself through a process that gets you, or should I say maintain an influence on you and creates an appetite of self-destructive or dysfunctional behavior. And once that is implanted, and now it is at a point of dealing with a perpetual cycle, now we deal with what we call the rebirthing of that condition. The process of learned association is chemically attached and therefore has replaced the natural process. With this, a rebirth is infused and the condition can be passed on to the next generation of targets without the need to repeat the initial learned injection. So in other words, what we're saying at that point is whatever I did to initially seed that weapon of destruction doesn't have to be reapplied with each generation, because I created the proper conditioning to where that generation that was initially affected is going to naturally pass on what I need them to do to the next generation. And see, this is where we start dealing with the dysfunctionality of the family unit and how that plays into a mass dysfunctionality of the community as a whole. Because I've accepted a family unit structure that is really self-destructive, but I've made it appear as though it is individually liberating to the people. Now is going to be defended by the masses. And once it's defended by the masses, that reintroduces it and creates that rebirthing condition that now allows it to continue to be part of what I now call the family structure. And then the individual will continue to reinforce it because they feed the next generation on that sickness. So keep that in mind. So those are the 4 stages, and that deals with what we call a quad factor. So now you got your square, as the Masons will call it. You have your square, which creates a 90-degree angle at all of your four corners. And we can go on and on from there, but I just want y'all to recognize the fact that you went from stage to stage to stage, which created that trifactor. And then remember, when you talk about the trifactor from a spiritual standpoint, you talk about the great Trinity. The great Trinity creates a Godhead, which what? Rebirths itself. Man, woman, child. Man, woman, child, trifactor. What does the child do? Create a rebirth and attach itself to what? A man or a woman to continue the cycle. And so that's where your stage 4 comes in. Your stage 4 is that next generation. So what you want to be able to do as it applies to a weapon is create the perfect weapon that will naturally be self-fulfilling, which is what we mean when we say perpetual cycle. And so the next thing here, once the the 4 stages are achieved, the ability to circumvent truth through time is possible, and history can be rewritten at will. So let me elaborate on that, because this is where we start really being able to recognize a pattern of oppression, but not able to do anything about it per se. So, for instance, without pointing fingers at anything, we are all aware of the fact that certain representations, physical representations within certain forms of religion are wrong, but they continue to be passed on from generation to generation. Why? Because we have come to the point of the acceptance. And even if we know that it's not true, the fact that we accept it as a mass condition of people mean that it will be re-interjected to the next cycle. So even though as an individual we know that mess is wrong, collectively we hold on to those images. We hold on to those false realities. And those false realities do what as it applies to our ability to critically think? It warps it. The more you hold on to a false narrative and justify holding on to a false narrative, you have to trick yourself from being a critical thinker. So then that gets into that element of dysfunction that I'm talking about, to the point to where now I have to justify dysfunctionality. Now I have to justify accepting and moving in the wrong direction. And as long as I do that, that basically means that will be reseeded in that next generation. Because guess what? You taught them that it's okay to live with that, which is a coping situation. And that coping situation came because of your denial to address it and nip it in the bud. You see, so coping and denial go together. They're buddies. They go together. Either we're coping or we're in denial. And when we're in denial, then we allow the next thing to cope. And so those form what we're talking about, to where history can be rewritten at will, and will be in all caps. And I think that I meant to say, even when the evidence is exposed that manipulation has occurred, the sheer amount of participation in falsehood overshadows logic in the mass settings, which is what I basically just said. So in other words, what I'm saying again, and to elaborate on that, is, like we said, even though the evidence is exposed that manipulation has occurred, based upon the amount of people that accept the falsehood, we tend to go along with it. And when we go along with it, that affects our ability to deal with the logic of mass logic. And so therefore, that's why we started off saying the individual either may accept it or recognizes it as a problem, and then the family kind of sort of sees it, but they still keep moving. But then by the time you deal with the masses, which goes into that, why we use the example of the monkey, the monkey mind concept. By the time you get at that highest level of participation, it gets watered down. The spirit gets watered down. The essence gets watered down. And so from that standpoint, it allows itself to continue to play out from generation to generation. So the next section about that is, this is the generational projected curse of social de-evolution. That's what's happening at that point. That is set in motion and maintained with the engineering of a people. This method of control is considered to be a necessity by the elite controlling class to keep order within a governance. There will always be a pocket of resistance, and I think this goes back to what B Token was kind of asking. So what we're saying here is there will always be a pocket of resistance, but the influence of the small pockets are not able to sustain a channel of support strong enough to wield revolutionary change, which is why synchronized direct action, which is unity and purpose, thought, I meant to say thought and principle. Let me correct that before I send this out to y'all. Purpose and thought, unity and purpose in thought and principle. Purpose, thought, and principle. That's another trifactor, is what we were saying here. There must be direct synchronization of direct action. And all of y'all that are grassroots organizers, we understand and understand what direct action is. But what we wanted to do is to draw a tri principle on that. Purpose, thought, and principle must be taught as a proper response within the grassroots movements. So that kind of goes into the answer of what we was dealing with, B Token, is that the problem is there's not enough synchronization in direct action, which basically means our grassroots movements are not unified in purpose, in thought, and in principle. And if we're not unified in that, then what we're saying is there's not enough of us on the battlefield to be able to make the necessary changes to spark the people to be awakened to this level of knowledge that can be put in a position of action. Because again, we talked about how it's a misnomer that people think knowledge is power. Because just to have awareness of something does not mean that you're going to now take action and put action behind it. That goes into the whole idea of mind cleansing, which creates the appetite so that the diet will sustain itself on higher levels of personal accountability. Because if a person is unwilling to hold themselves directly accountable for the way in which they live, they are still caught in a position of victimization. And as long as I'm still a victim, then I have pity. And as long as I have pity, I have self-pity. As long as I have self-pity, then I am okay with coping, because this is just how things is. It is what it is. You hear people say that shit. It is what it is. That's where that comes from. Okay? I am still living my life out as a victim. And I'm still traumatized from the conditions that I dealt with as a child. And when we are traumatized through certain things that happen to us as a youth, emotionally, we get stuck in that age in which that trauma has happened to us. So now, all of a sudden, from a psychological standpoint, that person is not growing. They're still traumatized. And so in order for them to move forward in life, they really have to be able to go back to when they was a child and remove that trauma and go forward again. This is why we said in the beginning, when we talked about the 3Ds and the 3Ps, at any point in that process to where you identify a mistake, you have to go back a step, make sure that you recodify it, and then move forward. But we have to be willing to do that. And in order to be willing to do that, we have to not look at the age or the amount of time that we have spent doing something wrong and be afraid to just accept the fact that, okay, it's wrong. Let me do it the right way. Let me learn something from possibly a younger generation and connect that and move and let us build to the point to where we're not having to deal with rediscovery again. Okay, so this is what's important here. Him, want to give y'all a new way of looking at that word. And this goes into the aspects of how things are formed. Handicapped education, dealing with the H, keeping the youth ignorant of real mathematics, real economics, real law, and real history by way of any inefficient processing methods designed to teach linear quantitative perception. I know that's a lot, but it's important as a revolutionary that you know what it means to be caught up in linear thinking. Linear thought is a very self-destructive process which goes against critical thinking. Get out of the mode of being a linear thinker. And that also applies right back to when we talk about fractal reality. When you are a linear thinker from that standpoint, then the only way you get to 3 is to recognize 1 plus 2. Obviously means 3. When you think that way and you're forced to think that way and you teach yourself to think that way, the only time you're going to recognize a pattern as if something precedes that pattern. Revolutionaries are supposed to be visionaries. In order to be a visionary, you have to be able to think ahead of things. You have to be nonlinear. You can't get caught up in the sequence that we talked about earlier in terms of how things are formed against you as weapons. The next one here, I for irrelevant entertainment. Keeping the masses on a pattern of supplied entertainment below the 6th grade level that is geared toward non-productive thoughts encased in emotions and desires fueled by luster and consumption. So now you see why that was mentioned earlier about the idea of consumption. The irrelevant entertainment is getting you caught up in a habitual pattern of doing something over and over again, whether it be physical, mental, or spiritual, that does not produce growth. It is not getting harder. Give you an example of something I used to do when I was a kid, and every now and then I catch myself doing it again. Think of the game, how from a nostalgia purpose, a lot of old schoolers like Asteroid, Centipede, and these games like that. The concept of the games is very simple. Before you know it, you done spent hours and hours trying to do what? Get the highest score, get the highest score. But what do you actually gain from spending hours of doing the same repetitive thing that does not create any higher level of knowledge or input or mental capacity over and over and over again? That's that hamster wheel mentality. You are conditioning your mind to stay on a hamster wheel, which causes you to physically be conditioned, because now you're sitting on a chair as a couch potato, spending hours trying to get a high score, which goes into your spiritual aspect of being brain dead, because you are not living life and not being exposed and experiencing things that meet your physical altitude or your physical level of where you're going. In other words, think of it like this. Whether we try or not, a 7-year-old would eventually be a 14-year-old, will eventually be 21 years old. Their body is going to naturally grow up. Unfortunately, that is not necessarily the case mentally or spiritually. So from that standpoint, anything we do to stunt our mental and spiritual growth will render us to be still viewed upon as a 21-year-old body because of the vessel. Most people identify us by our vessel. My vessel is 21 years old. So you tend to think that you deal with me like a 21-year-old, but I may be mentally and spiritually still a child, expected to operate as an adult. And because I cannot operate as a 21-year-old, what must I do in order to still participate in life? I must learn to navigate through obstacles. Period. I don't have time now, based upon my mental processing, to go back and correct and remove those obstacles. I must learn to run fast and jump over them and catch up with the rest of the 21-year-olds. So this is what happened to us mentally and spiritually. And irrelevant entertainment is one of the weapons that Going back to stage one, this is so you can see how that is applied. Stage one sets the tone for these type of things to happen, which is the irrelevant aspect of it. And then the handicap education actually goes into step two, which also feeds into step three, which becomes mind control, which is exercising direct influence over another mind deliberately or inadvertently. And the key to that mind control is influence over another mind. So, in other words, remember how in stage four we had a rebirthing process. The rebirthing has to do with what? Being able to transpire and pass this baton, this weapon baton, to the next person. And they what? Will carry it, and then they have to run faster down that obstacle course. You see, the goal is to be able to pass that baton. This is the psychological warfare happening. The goal is to pass that baton to my partner, and that they must run faster too. No one ever thinks about the fact that what the game we're playing is passing it on and then jumping over those hurdles and going faster than an obstacle course. My goal is to pass it. And so as I pass it, I'm dealing with that aspect of mind control, whether it be deliberately or inadvertently, which basically means that you are being manipulated unconsciously. We're almost done here. Let me go down to this next section, and then I ask the judge if anybody has any questions here. And I also want y'all to take note of the symbols that are embedded on this document too. It's kind of sort of the same symbol, but y'all see some hip hop artists and other people throw up that symbol. All right, search for the Manchurian candidate. So I'll go ahead and B Token, go ahead and speak real quick.
I just wanted to ask about the last page real quick. I can't if it was possible, if you could.
Go ahead.
Oh yeah, that's what. Within the mind control, a lot of time, every time I bring up, using, like you were saying, using some sort of process that they use against them, in the sense of conditioning our minds to control our conditioning. How would you say, like, is the best way to like quickly separate mind control and giving yourself the control?
I would say from that standpoint, what you have to do is now apply warfare. First and foremost, are you familiar with NLP, Neuro Linguistic Programming?
Yeah.
Good. So since you're familiar with that, you recognize the fact that what you have to be able to do is take a person and right then and there be able to see enough about them based upon body language, based upon nonverbal communication, as to how to go about engaging them. So there's no one method. In other words, everybody, when it comes to us reaching people, we have to reach people where they at. And in order to reach people where they at, or even in terms of the standpoint of, like, we go, when I said dealing with this from a martial science standpoint, I'm fighting the combatant, or I'm fighting my enemy. I have to be able to utilize my terrain, or utilize what we call borrowed energy in martial science against them. Oftentimes, especially when you're dealing with a more powerful opponent, the best approach is to borrow energy or use their energy against them by redirecting that strength and modifying it and offsetting it into a certain direction that takes them off course, because they wasn't aware of that maneuver. In order to do that, sometimes you, going back to the 48 laws of power, you have to not outshine the master, not appear as though you are smarter, because then you put them on the defense. And once you put them on the defense, now you got to take it, you got to go to the stage two, so to speak, or you got to go to game two. You make it you further extend it out. So from the standpoint of being able to do that, I would say, generally speaking, and obviously each situation is different, generally speaking, go into the idea of reactionary and revolutionary suicide. and cause a person to disarm themselves by not being able to not take advantage of a weakness that they think they see in you and wanting to go ahead and strike first. See, predators love to strike first, but they love to be opportunists. So you got to create a condition of opportunity that appears to be a once in a lifetime steal. And then from that standpoint, they can't resist to attack the target. But that target has to be a predisposed target that you evaluated right then and there. See, all this stuff takes practice. So get in the mindset of practicing on lesser opponents, so that, should I say, lesser skilled opponents, and work your way up the ladder. That is the best I can say on an open forum based upon really what you're asking me. Bunch, you go ahead.
I appreciate that.
I think give me a second. I'm gonna take this.
We can hear you, Bunch.
Can you hear me? Okay. I was gonna say you had me thinking that whole time you were going through the whole him thing. And then the question the token asked kind of added on to that, just because of how things have been transpiring in the city of Tacoma and the city of Lakewood recently, like the whole Western Washington, really, but specifically here. And I was thinking, as you were going through the whole hymn, I was thinking, wow, it's crazy. We look at these children that are gangbangers, and I can call even some of the adult ones children now just because I'm so much older than them. You know what I'm saying? At 22 years old, you still a kid.
Yep.
23, 24, you still a kid. It's cool. No disrespect intended. But I realized that the reason why they make it to that point, and the reason why everything that you've spoken on as far as attacking that mind state that leads you to lean into the conditioning as opposed to breaking away from it. They're forced to make men's choices with children's minds.
Yep.
And therefore, that's how they get to be 21, 22, 23 years old. And they look like men. Mm-hmm. And they're doing things that men should be doing, or making choices that men should be able to make. And they're making them incorrectly because they're making them with the mind of a child still, because they were never given that opportunity to develop. Mm-hmm. So therefore, it's the responsibility of their quote unquote OGs, much like it's our responsibility by being people who stepped into this field and decided to take on this task of being the ones who will take on the responsibility of helping raise the consciousness of other people to a revolutionary level that we may not see, as you said, in our lifetime, but those young men that I was just speaking about, and then even the young women who fall into that same category, or even fall into the category of being trafficked, all of those people, they're our responsibility.
Yep.
Because they should be the next Panthers.
Yes, right.
Not the next prisoners. That's what they should be. But because of the handicapped education, because they're not given an education that truly tells them who they are, why they are in the condition that they're in, and the best ways to get out of it, the best ways to avoid this becoming their long-term reality. They're not given that. Therefore, irrelevant entertainment has even more of an influence on them. And as a hip-hop artist myself, I can tell you, there's some bona fide brainwashing going on in the music industry. There's no joke about it. You can hear it when you listen to the music. There's no question about that. And that opens up the mind to the possibility of being controlled by something other than your own logic. That's why what we do is important. That's why what we do is important. And I hope that everybody who's on here, who is active in their community, I hope you take it just as serious as these words that we've heard tonight. Real talk. This is a serious thing that we undertake here. All power. Okay.
Thank you, Brother Bunchy. Thank you. Okay, let me move on real quick here. All right, search for the Manchurian candidate. Now we talk about how a lot of this comes together based upon what I've been seeing in what's happening to us. Functional disorder is what ends up happening. That actually goes into what you was talking about with the youth. existing without a known organic cause or direct mental structural change, coping and not solving the root or base condition of the disorder, or disalter or disorder, surviving under a distress, not living to put the fun in dysfunctional. Because think about it, oftentimes that's what's going on with the youth. They are moving at such a fast pace that dysfunction has to be fun. And what happens also is when you get good at survival, so to speak, then you become a self-fulfilling prophecy, or example of how survival should supersede living. And so therefore, when someone comes to you and lets you know that you have been surviving as opposed to living, the mere fact that you have survived this long and that you've been in situations to where it was life or death, now it is awfully hard for you to question the process that has kept you alive this long, to unlearn that in order to move forward with something that is actually more productive for you as you develop. Because all you know is that this is what has saved my physical life up until this point. And all of a sudden I got this old head telling me that I'm wrong. This old head telling me that I've been looking at things the incorrect way. How dare you? Because it has what kept me alive so to this degree. And so what happens with that is that we again become victims of our surroundings, victims of our environment, and that environment continues to perpetuate and feed itself, and that's that perpetual cycle. And from that standpoint, it takes somebody from the outside, so to speak, in terms of the consciousness, to extract you from that. But you first and foremost, your appetite has to change. Your appetite has to change. And what we tend to think we can do is appeal to them within that same appetite by saying, instead of making your money this way, make it this way. But that typically don't usually works, because making it the other way tends to cause you to have to work harder just to do the same thing. So from that standpoint, the appetite has to change. And once the appetite changes, then the environment in which I'm, cropping is no longer something that I care to be around or care to be in. So from a mental and a spiritual level, once my appetite has changed, now I am ready to accept accountability. And so therefore my will or my drive, going back to what we talked about, let me see the actual words I used earlier, awareness, feeling, and motivation as a function can actually come into play. The next one here is the consumption identity. And that was spoke on earlier by one of y'all. The identifier that leads to the removal of constructive awareness and replaces it with possessions that define the target's identity, and the perpetual collective avoidance of generating output. Key here is what we underline: perpetual, again, the word perpetual, collective avoidance. So basically what that means, again, going into the difference from the trifecta as the individual, the family, and the collective, we deal with a collective, a perpetual collective avoidance, which basically means that the community is incapable of creating a changed environment that will actually produce better or productive individuals and productive family cycles, because we are dealing with a collective avoidance. And so this is why we say the appetite must change, because the family structure and the individual thought process don't match up and meet up with what needs to happen collectively. They're actual contradictions is what they are. And unless you are able as an individual to be able to move away from the contradiction of what makes you collectively empowered, you're going to find yourself not really being able to add to the movement from the standpoint of what needs to be presented to the people that are also in that same condition. And that's a tough pill to swallow, as well as especially from an emotional content, a content level, is being able to have the altitude, the mental, emotional altitude to recognize that you are moving against natural law. And when we say natural law, we talk about physical, mental, and spiritual um, fractal reality in terms of what is naturally existing in nature in a level of something that is not abnormal but normal, that creates reproduction from the standpoint of mental, physical, and spiritual. As well as now that we're talking about it from a psychological level, this is why that word psychology is again dealing with the study of the mind, and then using the Manchurian Candidate, or using the project I referenced earlier, telling people to really look at any project or any form of things that's been used against us as a whole, and study those. So like I said, the MK Ultra, so that we can really see what has been done to us. Because if we can't, then we're not able to identify an enemy. So that consumption identity creates and identifies codependency, which is a relationship in which a person is physically, physiologically, addicted or conditioned to a specific pattern that renders them incapable of operating from a position of self-control or self-determination. So now keep in mind, when we talk about the Black Panther movement, no matter, pretty much, I want to say every one of the platforms has something that identifies self-determination, right? So if you can't get to a position of self-control, which is being able to identify emotional intelligence, you're definitely not going to be able to get to the level of critical thinking and logic that gets you to the path of self-determination. So see, the key word here is self, or self, right? So when we talked about politics, remember the first thing that we said we have to address in terms of politics is recognizing self-governance. Before you even get into talking about or saying, oh, vote for this or vote for that. Okay, what is self-governance, right? So knowledge of self. So self-control first and foremost is, as you have self-control, now you can shape a reality or an environment that deals with self-determination, which means that you are able to be aware of the difference between a choice and an option at that point, and understand the difference between freedom and liberty. So this takes us to the position on recognizing power. But now you're not able to recognize power until you can recognize functional disorder, consumption, or codependency. So recognize and notice how we're giving you this trifactor. These three conditions must be able to be identified so that you can actually recognize power. Power is the ability to act, to do or act capably of doing or accomplishing something through will. And remember how earlier we had that word capitalized, the full word capitalized, through will. The possession of authority, of control or command over others. And we referenced that as when we talked about mind control as well, when we started talking about influence over others. So now we're talking about power as it applies to something being over others. And now I want to bring something else to y'all, just so I can make sure y'all are able to connect the dots. The symbol behind this document is the essence of over others. Over others. So just think about that in terms of the all-seeing eye, the omni, so to speak. So when you talk about commanding control over others, certain aspects, whether it be through positional, informational, situational, relational, punitive, coercive, or charismatic. So aspects of the way power is presented. So Be able to identify those and deal with those. And from the standpoint, you got the quad going on within this, but you also have two sides of that relationship. So be aware of that. Now, power is often exchanged for protection, governance, or guidance. In other words, the masses grant dominance over the collective by pledging natural born rights, which is freedoms, in exchange for civil liberties. This is where most of the people are lost, right there, not knowing in essence what they have done. When you pledge your allegiance, extraction of the Negro, define a diet that removes the consumption of surface level stimulants. We talked about that earlier. Removing the consumption again, right? Removing consumption. But what are we moving consumption of? Surface level stimulants, which goes into that acronym of HIM that we talked about earlier, dealing with handicapped education, irrelevant information, and mind control. Those are the topsoil components of mental destruction. So we're talking about removing the consumption of surface level stimulants or top level mentality. So fuel the need for deep rooting and develop replication of design that grows a knowledge of self. Again, fuel the need for deep rooting and develop replication of design that grows a knowledge of self. Let this pattern of keeping choice. Remember, we talked about the difference between choice and options. So let this pattern of keeping choice be the main course meal, which is why we refer to an appetite, right? So that's important. So what I'm showing you now is, in essence, the solution point of view or perspective that has to be had based upon identifying what we talked about here within this trifactor of the enemy to our the enemy to our liberation. So then we talk about the self-determination, the ability to determine and control the process of defining who we are. This is why we end where we started, defining who we are, what we are, when we are, where we are, and why we are. So all of those elements must be dealt with when you talk about defining. If you leave something out, then you're going to end up having to take yourself back to one of the original situations before you dealt with defining, which was your perception. So these angles go into the perception. The added point of when involves the state of consciousness in recognition of perception, which is what I basically just said, which is observed through time-space awareness that breaks the classical conditioning stage cycles, which is how you're able to stop the rebirth of the dysfunctionality. The why is because, as defining our collective say so, we shall organize around the self-proclaimed authority and exercise the point of human liberty over civil injustice. The where we are allows the perpetual enslavement to stop and give us a center of self to see past the stimulation we have been fed as a reality. And remember, we talked about how stimulation, I'm sorry, not stimulation, simulation. I said stimulation, I meant simulation. That simulation replaced our reality earlier on. So from that point of view, and from that position, we have to basically undo it. And so when we talk about self-determination, we have to deal with defining those different areas in terms of self, which goes into the whole self-governance. And at that point, now you have what is necessary to move the people to a higher level. So think of this trifactor as it applies to that. Knowing what power is, knowing how to extract the mentality of a Negro. Now, when I'm breaking that word down into no-grow or Negro, which is someone that is not growing, that is caught in a linear path. Don't think of that Don't be narrow-minded and think of that in terms of a racial type. We're talking about people that don't grow. I refer to them as Negroes. You don't grow. Okay? So, in essence, just recognize that we must have power. We must be able to extract our people, which are the ones that are caught up in this mess, from their conditions, and then deal with self-determination. And so, with that, I simply provided just a few links. You know, this is a lot that can get covered that wasn't covered in terms of references, but just gave y'all a few links that you can go check out. And then this barcode here goes into I think what we call a link tree that can send you to just other sources of information as it applies to some things that we have in San Diego. Any questions? Anybody got any questions or want to make any statements? Go ahead, Doc. You got your hand up.
Yeah, I have a question. You might have kind of answered it, but just so as far as the idea of the trifactor, and a lot of the time you've talked about the idea that, you know, we have these two things and we need to add a third thing in order to gain power over a situation and understanding. How does that tie in? How directly does that tie in with the concept of like the Hegelian concept of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis?
Oh, that is actually, think of that as another form of that, because from that standpoint, you're talking about, and I want to make sure we see this the same way. You're talking about the unseen or the unknown, and then you're talking about it being synthesized, and then you're also talking about how it is carried out or conducted across the spectrum of what I refer to as time, space, and gravity, reality. And that kind of goes into a whole different discussion than what I wanted us to talk about. But that does play, or should I say, that kind of is one of the same. It's just another way of looking at a trifactor. I hope that makes sense to you. But
absolutely, thank you.
But most people are not logical enough to be able. I don't come with the one you came with, because a lot of times just using those three talks over people's head, which is why I ended up going into the whole thing about time, space, reality, and gravity. Because now when you start identifying them that way, now I have to start really breaking down fractal reality. And so then we want to start getting into aspects of metaphysics, at least how I would come across with it. And then I don't want to I may cause folks to look at me cross-eyed at that point. So in other words, make sure when we engage the people, again, like I said earlier, practice neurolinguistic programming just from the standpoint of being able to find a way to give somebody a symbol that they can refer back to, that can introduce them into a concept of higher thought. But now understand that as revolutionaries and as freedom fighters and people that are involved in wanting to and needing to have our people to come to a higher level, is that the first impulse oftentimes that happens is when if a person is not in a right in what's referred to as a righteous state of mind, meaning they have knowledge of self to the point to where they don't see themselves as being inferior, or they have an inferiority complex. When I engage in a conversation and I sound like I'm more intelligent than you, I may be intimidated, or I may find that to be a problem. So right then and there, I'm going to put my guard up as we have a discussion, because of me not being at a right place within myself, I'm going to come off and say, oh, you think you better than me. So now all of a sudden we can't even have a good dialogue, because it done turned into some what I call nigga shit now. And we don't want to do that. We want our people to embrace what we have to provide them. So we have to make sure that when we see them for who they are, that they are okay with looking at themselves naked in the mirror. Most people don't, when they see themselves physically naked, they don't like what they see and they want to change something. So just imagine how that operates on a mental and a spiritual level. Okay? If a person physically is unwilling to accept their physical appearance, how in the hell do you think they're ready to accept their mental and spiritual appearance? You see?